It began with the entity, a being that exists beyond our reality, outside of any material universe. The entity is a being comprised of and fueled by human emotion. To sate its hunger, it abducts human and non-human beings alike from all throughout history and even from different universes. And many of the beings it captures wind up in some way or another stuck in the Trials. The Trials are every single match of Dead by Daylight ever played, where a small group of intrepid survivors must endure the worst horrors the entity can throw at them through its proxies, the Killers. These survivors and killers can come from any time period in any universe, and that gives us a massively diverse range of characters from throughout space and time. This also allows for major licensed crossovers with big names in and beyond horror to weave their universes into that of the entity, without causing canonicity problems. In one universe, the world can end in 2009 so that Bill Overbeck can be taken by the entity during Left 4 Dead, but in a different universe, that world could survive until the 22nd century, so that Ellen Ripley can board the Nostromo and be taken when the time comes at the end of Alien. For the past 9 years, the world of Dead by Daylight has been expanding backwards and forwards into time, giving us tales from the far future, the distant past, and around the world. So today I thought it would be fun to look back at all these different time periods the entity has plundered from, to get events in order to the best of my ability, and create a full timeline of everyone so far that the entity's hunger has touched. Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers, to the complete Dead by Daylight lore timeline. In short, it's the story of everything. And that story begins deep in the annals of history. For a long time now, a staple of DBD's character lineup has been historical domain killers, people taken from real periods in history as representatives of a certain place at a certain time. It's wild to think that we only started getting them a few years after the game came out, but they've been some of the most consistently well-received original killers ever. So today we'll be kicking off by digging into Dead by Daylight's historical horrors. Our story begins in ancient Babylonia in about the 18th century BC, where a 5-year-old girl was left on a temple doorstep and taken in by the priest Haban. Adiris grew into a priestess of the sea goat, but experienced the whispers of the entity throughout her life. It deceived her into believing the gods were speaking to her, goading her first to sacrifice her father figure Haban, and then into a position of leadership once a contagious disease crippled the population. Fighting through the infection at the head of a procession of followers, Adiris led the sick and devoted of Babylon to a quiet cave outside Babylonia where she prayed fervently for salvation. Her prayers were answered, but not by the god she wanted. The entity claimed Adiris, the plague, as a killer for the fog, and her followers were never seen again. All those followers that went missing, yeah, you can just forget about them. They're not going to come back up later, I promise. Like most historical killers, we're not given anything concrete resembling an exact date for Adiris' life and abduction, but the Akkadian cuneiform in her temple was in common use in about 2000 BCE, and the cuneiform itself mentions Idin Sin, a Babylonian king who ruled from 2000 to 1900 BCE, so that dates her pretty closely to that time period. Adiris' fate as a killer is well documented, but what's less clear is what happened to her followers. I have my own theory about what happened to those guys, but we'll get into that later. We've got 4,000 years of history to cover, and our next stop takes us to the late Middle Ages, Italy, in 1343. In 1343, Vittorio Toscano was born into the lap of luxury as the nephew of the Duke of Portoscuro. His father tried to encourage him to take up military pursuits, but he refused every time he was prompted. Violence was the tool of those too impatient, ignorant, or inhuman to think of a proper solution. That's what Vittorio believed. So he went to study with his uncle Renzo instead, who taught him about the Observers, bearers of powerful arcane knowledge that lived in a different dimension altogether, sealed away from the world. As he grew up, Vittorio sought out these Observers and the Lapis Paradisus, an artifact rumoured to be able to reach the Observer's dimension, and to do this he enlisted the help of the mercenary knight Taros Korvac. While Vittorio grew up in his cushy study reading books, Taros lived a brutal life of slavery, violence and exploitation. Abducted from his home in Hungary by a mercenary band known as the Guardia Compagna, Taros was taught to kill from a young age, and befriended a few fellow slaves, Sandor Rolt, Alejandro Santiago and Dorcos Malacek. But his horrifying experiences growing up had hardened him into a cruel and cynical worldview, where might makes right, the rules and norms of society are constructs of the weak to be discarded, and the harshness of the world demands violence and cruelty to survive. He fell into Vittorio's employ during his search for the Lapis Paradisus, and the two travelled Europe visiting ancient temples to hunt the artifact down. An ancient secret organisation had built temples and enclaves they visited, and the puzzle pieces led them to Sintra in Portugal, where the locals refused to allow the group access. Taros put Sintra to the sword and took Vittorio prisoner, claiming the Lapis Paradisus and returning to Portoscuro as its new lord and master. He liberated the Guardia Campagna and razed the countryside of Italy to the ground while he tried to pry the secrets of the Lapis Paradisus out of Vittorio. But before he could get anywhere, Vittorio inscribed the secret sigils that he had uncovered on the floor of his cell and escaped into the entity's realm. It wasn't that much later before Taros was taken too, as the lords of Italy rallied an army to march on Portoscuro, and he and his men were taken into the fog in a haze of battle. Somewhat unusually for Dead by Daylight's historical lore, we're actually given a precise date both for Vittorio's birth and for Vittorio and Taros's trip to Sintra, since that explicitly took place in 1391, meaning Vittorio was 48 when it all went down. But less than a century later, in a different world altogether, a Europe in another dimension faced a threat even greater than an angsty Hungarian guy and his band of merry madmen. It was 1476, and the Dark Lord Count Dracula was terrorising Wallachia. Yep, it's the events of Castlevania 3, where Trevor Belmont leads a group of adventurers to Dracula's castle and wound up killing him. Well, as close as anyone could reasonably come to killing Dracula anyway. Despite saving the world and finding love with the mage Cypher Belnaris, Trevor returned to Wallachia still shrouded in suspicion, and wound up living an isolated life in the woods. One evening he heard something outside. Not just an animal, but something far worse. The kind of thing Trevor hoped he would never have to see again. He never returned to his home that night. The entity had claimed him, but it would wait centuries before taking Dracula himself. The 17th century when things started to get really cooking, as a pair of conjoined twins were born in Marseille in France. As soon as they first horrified their midwife, Charlotte and Victor Deshailles were taken away by their mother Madeleine, and the three ran into the wilderness out of fear for the twins' survival. They lived undiscovered for 5 years before they were caught, and Madeleine was burned at the stake for witchcraft, an unfortunately real fate that befell many mothers of conjoined twins back then. Charlotte and Victor were forced to watch before being bought by a shadowy organisation and carted off to a secret enclave run by mystics in black hoods and cloaks. For years they were the subjects of arcane experimentation, until they were placed upon a sacrificial altar as a blood offering to the cult's mysterious god. Those mystics in black cloaks, you know, their whole human sacrifice business, that might seem a little familiar, but trust me, it doesn't matter, they're not coming back again, so just forget about them. Look, I'm a YouTuber. If there's one thing YouTubers would never do, it's lie to you, right? The twins set the building on fire and escaped, but the trauma and injury they suffered cost little Victor his life, and Charlotte never really knew how to live without him. For Charlotte's entire adolescence, she grew up alone, wandering France pursued by both the mystics and the witch hunters, and forced to kill and steal to survive. She grew bitter as she mourned Victor's death and learned to hate the world that had come to fear her, until one winter she lay hypothermic and dying in the snow. But her long-dead brother sprang back to life. Victor burst from her chest and ran into a dark fog, and Charlotte quickly gave pursuit, longing more than anything to see her brother again and reunite the bond that should never have been broken. The twins were together again, as killers in the entity's service. Not too long after that, in the late 17th or early 18th century, in the golden age of piracy, a young girl named Portia May was growing up in the Caribbean colony of Fortune. Her father was a wealthy merchant and landowner in the city, and she led a comfortable life before a trip back from Italy saw their ship boarded by the pirate lord Mad Moloch. Moloch kills her father, makes his crew fight to the death, and forces this 12-year-old girl Portia to guide them back to Fortune so they can pillage the settlement. But Portia tricks them, and runs the ship aground in the Dragon's Tooth, an island tainted by the entity in the Bermuda Triangle. Alongside her canine companion Snug, Portia grows into a brutal survivalist as she kills both the otherworldly predators of the Overlap and other castaways, until she makes it to adulthood, where her father's old ship emerges from the gloom. A gift from the entity, perhaps. She rallies the castaways into a crew and sets out on the high seas, but not before her beloved dog Snug vanishes, like he was never even there. Portia spends decades on the seas hunting Moloch down, and eventually tracks him down to his island stronghold where she feeds his son to him on a silver platter. But she's about to finish the job when Moloch is taken by the entity. Portia follows him in, with her loyal companion Snug waiting for her on the other side. Not too long after the golden age of piracy ended in the middle of the 19th century, 3 separate killers were undergoing their own origin stories at about the same time. It's wild to think that these 3 stories were all taking place at once in different parts of the world, maybe only a decade or 2 apart from each other. In about 1840, Talbot Grimes was stationed in India, experimenting on Chinese prisoners captured in the Opium War. Talbot had spent his youth studying at, and then being booted out, of the London School of Medicine, but the British East India Company paid him to produce a powerful productivity-inducing stimulant by experimenting on captured Chinese prisoners of war. This dates this era of his life to 1840 to 1843, because that was after the start of the First Opium War, but before the East India Company was dissolved in 1874. After the drug Talbot developed turned out to be lethal to huge numbers of recipients, the company cut him loose and into the care of the Black Veil, an organisation of mystics in black cloaks and hoods. He learned the secrets of the arcane from the Black Veil scholars, and eventually used their wisdom to enter the fog, first as a survivor, and then eventually as a killer, once his experimentation with the pustular serum ensured his transformation into the Blight was complete and irreversible. Blight's lore gets a lot more complicated when he enters the fog, but perhaps just as important as the Blight himself, we have the first named appearance of the Black Veil, the cult that worships the entity that constantly comes back as a recurring DVD antagonist. The Black Veil were actually first named in the Twins lore, when they were the group of mystics that experimented on them when they were children, and to be the people behind the arcane ruins and artifacts that Vittorio and Tarosh find in their lore. And verging into the realm of fan interpretations here, I believe that Adiris' worshippers, who she left behind when the entity claimed her as a killer, were cured by the entity and turned into the first Black Veil cultists, given that Adiris' religion was also comprised of black-hooded devotees who indulge in human sacrifice, who literally had their life saved by the entity when Adiris offered herself to it. I must reiterate, this is strictly my interpretation, but the Black Veil will be recurring a lot throughout this video, and I want to get this idea out of the way now. But first, we'll be taking a trip west. Very, very west, because we're going to the Midwest United States in 1845. 1845 marked the start of the Irish potato famine, where the harshness of British occupation in Ireland forced thousands of impoverished Irish families out of the country, many of whom settled in the United States. One such couple had a child not long after arriving, a weedy young boy called Caleb Quinn. Caleb was a born tinkerer, who grew up to create advanced technology which was stolen by his boss at the railroad, Henry Bayshaw. He almost killed Bayshaw in reprisal, which got him a long sentence in Hellshire Penitentiary in Nebraska, where he made a deal with the warden to commute his sentence. He would take up jobs as a bounty hunter for the prison, leading the Hellshire gang with his custom-built spear gun to reel his targets in alive, ready to do hard time in his stead. And he did this job for many years, even after his sentence was over. But when he discovered that he was being played, that the warden was in league with Bayshaw the entire time, he flew into a wild rage at being betrayed again, and he led a massacre at the prison, which saw Bayshaw and the warden ripped apart by Hellshire's inmates. When the entity took him, it found Caleb a broken man, embittered by hatred and betrayal, and promised him a new life as the Deathslinger. Assuming Caleb's parents raised him shortly after the Irish potato famine, Caleb would have been taken in the late 19th century or maybe very early 20th century. But near the time of his birth, a major historical event was happening in Japan. In 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed, allowing US trading ships into Japan for the first time and ending Japan's years of isolation. As the Tokugawa shogunate fell into decline, social mobility became a reality for more of Japan's peasant classes, and a whole merchant class was beginning to form. A young nobleman named Kazan Yamaoka saw the shifting social landscape and decided that the best solution to this problem involved a kanabo and lots of yelling. Against the wishes of his father Renjiro, Kazan spent his life crusading across Japan, putting peasants, foreigners, and so-called fake samurai to the sword. Not even his father Renjiro could stop him from ripping the tongue out of the lord who insulted him with the name Oni Yamaoka. Kazan's demise after the fact was at least fitting, bested by an entire mob of peasants, tortured and left to die in an old windmill, and ultimately being taken on his deathbed by the entity and warped into something far, far worse, the Oni he had always feared he would become. But Kazan left a child behind, his crippled son Akito, who would continue the Yamaoka lineage for decades to come, even as the bloody legacy of Kazan lingered over the family. I'm sure this chapter that was literally called Cursed Legacy will not have any bearings on future storytelling with regards to, descendants or anything, so you can just forget about it now. As we enter the pre-war 20th century, we start to get a higher concentration of killers, and it starts with one Sally Smithson, who loses her husband Andrew in a lumberwork accident and is forced to work at the Crotus Pren Asylum. After 20 years of hard work at the asylum, her eugenicist beliefs and the stress of asylum work overcome her duty of care, and she kills every patient and staff member in the asylum. The ambulance carrying her away goes off the road, and the entity takes it from here, until she becomes the horrible blinking S-tier menace that she is today, as the nurse. But at about the same time as Sally snaps, a squad of World War I soldiers wander through the wrong part of the Red Forest in Russia. Before they know it, a group of trained soldiers find themselves on the wrong end of a hatchet, hunted and cut apart by a skilled and patient stalker in a white rabbit mask who strikes from the woods and leaves no survivors. The huntress Anna was raised in the woods alone by her mother in the cabin she built for the two of them in the deep dark of the Red Forest. Anna was raised to be as self-sufficient as possible, to hunt animals for food and defend their territory like her life depended on it, because it sort of did. But as a girl, Anna is left alone when her mother is gored on the antlers of a giant elk, and she spends her adolescence and adulthood completely isolated. She resorts to stealing children in the night from her local villages to beat that loneliness, to try to capture something resembling motherhood. But while her mother taught her to survive on her own, she never learned how to care for anyone else. At some point after she kills these soldiers in her tomb and takes a few of their trinkets as trophies, Anna is taken by the entity, and the forest becomes quiet once again. From this point on, the horrors of war descend upon the world as we move into the slasher age, and the post-war era sees the landscape of killers that we see changing dramatically. But before we do, I've got this note in my script. Wait, hang on. What the fuck does 600 CY mean? Oh yeah, I forgot. Dungeons & Dragons has its own calendar, because of course it does. There's always one, isn't there? Wizards, you guys just have to be different, don't you? 600 in the common year calendar is the present day in the Dungeons & Dragons setting of Greyhawk, home to the powerful purple bold lich turned purple powerful bold deity, Vecna. While doing traditional evil activities, presumably after getting his ass kicked by a bunch of murder hobos, Vecna starts investigating strange arcane disappearances throughout the world. At the site of one of the disappearances, he discovers a cursed text presumably written by the Black Veil of this dimension, or a similar group worshipping the entity. He decodes its secret language, sensing some unimaginable eldritch power from way beyond the multiverse that he knows thus far, and submits himself semi-willingly to the fog. Best to play the role of the pawn for now so he can learn the entity's secrets and potentially return to Earth one day with the power of the fog at his command. Yeah, good luck with that, Baldy. That's pretty big talk for a high B tier. Vecna's disappearance saw his fortress, the Rotted Tower, abandoned, only to be discovered by an adventuring party, the Troop. Two bards lead the group, the elf Aestri Yazar and her adopted human son, Bearmar Uraz. The two find Vecna's abandoned tower. Bearmar reads the arcane text on the entity that Vecna translated, monumentally failing his wisdom check on that one, and Aestri and Bearmar are taken by the entity. And thus we enter the Slasher Age, a time after the World Wars where global communication via telephone, television, and eventually the early days of the internet start to sink into our everyday lives, and the world gets a little bit smaller as a result. International politics and real-life stories of serial killers become recurrent themes of the chapters set in these days, and many more contemporary licenses start to enter the fog as well, as classics of slasher horror become enlisted into the entity's service. And it began in the 1950s, when two of Dead by Daylight's earliest killer releases carved a bloody legacy across America. Under the alias Jeffrey Hawk, the sadistic serial killer Kenneth Chase roamed America, travelling from circus to circus in the guise of a clown. He grew up as a disturbed young man who killed animals in his youth before abandoning his alcoholic father to wander the country once he started taking human lives. He indulged his sadistic urges on whoever took his fancy during his decades on the road. When a victim escaped his clutches, he woke up his horse Maurice and ran into the fog, where the entity awaited him with open arms. Helpfully, we're actually given specific dates for various events in the clown's lore. He was born in 1932, left home in 1954, not long after he killed his first victim, and spent the rest of his life on the road. As to when he was taken, it's a little less clear, but one helpful clue here is his add-on VHS porn. VHS tapes didn't overtake Betamax tapes in popularity until about 1982. So unless our favourite middle-aged drug-addicted murder clown was also a tech hipster and early adopter of VHS, it puts his abduction well into the 80s, meaning his career of murder spanned almost half a century or more without ever getting caught. The 1950s marked the collapse of the McMillan family mines, the biggest mining operation in the Seattle area, and the hands of Evan McMillan, the man who would later become the Trapper. The events of Evan's lore are a little bit messy. It's all mired in a cat's cradle of retcons, but the tome, the most recent stuff we have for him, seems to suggest that Archie was the tyrant of the McMillan Mining Company, treating his workers like absolute garbage and grooming Evan to abuse the workers, dehumanizing them as nothing but maggots, and pushing away any attempts Evan made to connect with them, to get close to anybody except his father. Eventually, Evan snapped and buried the miners under heaps of rock and rubble, in an engineered mine explosion, before finishing off his cruel and haggard father and switching one master for another, the Entity. The machinery of the McMillan estate, especially the furnace of the Ironworks of Misery, dates the McMillan estate at somewhere around the 1950s, and the clothes Evan wore in the flashback in Tome 1 reminds me of these pieces of 1930s workwear, so that's the closest we have to the present day of Trapper's story, I think. In the 1960s, a mysterious group of rich businessmen began to fund an equally mysterious man called Otto Stamper to oversee life in the Fold, an isolated community on a private island where the marginalised, rejected and downtrodden found themselves washing up. This new community purported to be a place where goodness could live undisturbed by the perils of modern life, and bad thoughts were expelled. But the dogma Stamper's community lived under hid a darker secret, and before long, people started to go missing. Rumours spread of something called the Drawny, a bugbear or a monster that haunted the town and preyed on the paranoia and fears of its citizens. People were banned from sleeping so that their nightmares could not feed it, but all that did was ramp up the fear, and before long the island was in a panic. Stamper took immediate action and called the citizens of the Fold together for a ceremony at a desolated beach, which culminated in sacrificing a journalist who'd been caught poking around in the town. Stamper blamed her for the horrors that had been inflicted upon the town, and as the cult was whipped into a frenzy, he instructed his faithful to root out the non-believers among them. Neighbour turned on neighbour, accusations turned to fury, turned to violence, and the Fold citizens turned on each other in an orgy of blood, just as Stamper had always planned. The sheer magnitude of the horror Stamper had inflicted carved a wound in reality, a scar in the fabric of the world. And as Stamper stood alone among the dead, something came through. The Drawny fed on the broken bodies of the faithful, nourished on the muck of gore and misery, until only Stamper was left. It paused, as if it recognised what had been done, and thus the entity claimed the dredge for its own. Oh, and as for what happened to Stamper, well, we'll see. But let's talk about something else that happened in the 1960s. A disfigured young boy in rural America was chained up in a barn with just a TV for company. The Adventures of Superman and Leave It to Beaver were his only companions in a life of solitude and abuse at the hands of his parents, Max and Evelyn Thompson. Young Max Jr. is inspired by his favourite superhero to break out of his confinement and wreak havoc on Coldwind Farm, butchering his parents and the corrupt cops that were complicit in his abuse. Shortly after his liberation, he was taken by the Entity, but it's a little unclear about when that liberation took place. In the early days of Benedict Baker, he originally claimed he was from 1896, but everything we have in Billy's lore seems to indicate otherwise, that he grew up in the 50s and escaped from his parents as a young adult in the 60s. The trick here is in the TV shows. The two TV shows that Max watched as a kid made that pretty clear, because they're name dropped in his tome. Leave It to Beaver broadcast from 1957 to 1963, and The Adventures of Superman broadcast originally from 1952 to 1958, but was re-syndicated to local stations and broadcast in colour for the first time in 1965. This suggests that either Max grew up with Superman when he was a boy in the early to mid-50s and then watched Leave It to Beaver in the late 50s and early 60s, or that his childhood was in the late 50s and 60s when he watched Beaver, and then he grew into adulthood watching the Superman syndicated reruns from 1965. It could reasonably be either way. The technology isn't really different enough between the 50s and the 60s to make it particularly clear, but I think I figured out which one it is, and the clue is in the pigs. Max and Evelyn's prize pigs, Duke and Donnie, are mentioned in Tome 5 as a major part of Billy's life growing up. Billy was forced to feed and take care of these pigs for years. They weren't for slaughter. These pigs lived in the lap of luxury while little Max was growing up, and they're named after the rock and roll duo Donnie and the Duke. Donnie and the Duke are not exactly the most well known of musicians, with the only record I can find of them being this song, Rock Baby, which you can find on this vinyl. According to both Discogs and an eBay listing I found for the original vinyl, Rock Baby is dated to 1958, and assuming the names of those pigs are an intentional parallel to Donnie and the Duke, I think that just about solves our mystery. If those pigs have been around since Billy was a kid, then logically they would have had those names since they were piglets many years ago, suggesting that 1958, when Rock Baby was published, was during Billy's childhood rather than his adulthood, which lines up with him watching Beaver as a kid that started airing in 58 as well. That means Billy's breakout was likely once he'd grown up in the later half of the 60s, after those Superman reruns had been syndicated in 1965, and he was taken by the Entity shortly afterwards. God, I love my job sometimes, guys, I really do. While Max Thompson Jr. takes his freedom into his own hands by massacring the corrupt cops in the employ of his parents, Frank Stone goes on a killing spree in Cedar Hills, Oregon in 1963, and faces off with a cop of his own. Frank spent his life hearing voices, dreaming terrible things and being manipulated by his grandmother, and when he takes a therapist in Cedar Hills, his life only got worse. That's unfortunately what happens when your therapist is Dr. Augustine Lieber, a dedicated worshipper of the Entity who encourages Frank's horrifying visions and inducts Frank into the Entity's service directly, grooming him into a future killer. He abducts the baby Jaime with the intent to sacrifice him at the Cedar Steel Mill, but is killed by Cedar Hills police officer Sam Green. This will not relate to anything that happens later, I promise. Before we move on to the 1970s, a few other cool things happened in the 60s that also won't relate to anything that happens later, I promise. From 1967 to 1970, the Nigerian Civil War decimated the country and destroyed the life of a young Philippa Jomo, whose birth family and later found family were both destroyed by raiders, who left him desolated and alone. He doused the raiders in petrol and scorched them to death in their camp, leaving him severely burned amidst the smouldering remains of the camp. Also in 1964, Nicolas Cage was born, which didn't cause any pain and suffering to anyone except the poor unlucky sods who bought tickets to The Wicker Man 2008 actually expecting a good movie. In 1973, at least two different killers were making their mark on history, the first of which was written in the blood of a small group of teenagers travelling across Texas. Sally Hardesty, her brother Franklin and their friends stumbled upon a defiled burial ground in Newt, Muerto County, Texas, only to pick up a strange hitchhiker who slashes Franklin's hand with a pocket knife and smears his blood on the outside of their van. This leads to the chain of events known as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, when the unassuming gas station cook, the hitchhiker, and their chainsaw-wielding brother known as Leatherface slaughter the entire party, with the sole exception of Sally Hardesty, who escapes just at the rise of the sun. Faced with the reality of his family being found out, Leatherface is abducted by the Entity, where he's free to kill and devour at his leisure, so long as he appeases his new master. But there was something else happening, in South America this time. A second killer waiting to happen, whose marks were painted not in blood, but ink. Only a month or so after the events of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, something even worse was happening in Chile. With the aid and backing of the CIA, the fascist Augusto Pinochet seized control of Chile in a military coup against the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende on September 11, 1973. He cracked down on political expression and criticism of his regime. At least in the DVD universe, he's implied to have had the support of the Black Veil. VAC label. But there was a thorn in his side. The expressionist artist Carmina Mora led an enclave of creatives in defiance of the regime, using her sensitivity to the entity to inspire her paintings and start a political revolution. Pinochet, the CIA, and the Black Veil worked together to capture and torture her, causing her abduction by the entity and her transformation into the killer that we know today as the artist. But this wasn't the only skullduggery the CIA was up to during the 1970s, because our boy Otto Stamper was back in the story, this time working at the CIA black site known as the Larry's Memorial Institute. By this point, it's unclear how much he was still connected with the Black Veil or even what he was doing at the Larry's, but he had taken a young neuroscientist, Dr. Herman Carter, as a protege, and trained him in the ways of enhanced interrogation and psychological warfare. We don't quite know the circumstances around which Herman lashed out, but we all know how it ended. When the Larry's Memorial Institute went silent for a week, the CIA sent its people to check out the place and figure out what was going on. But the doctor was already gone, snapped up by the entity and leaving only a pile of corpses and the barely living brain-dead husk of Otto Stamper behind. In terms of exactly when this happened, Doctor's story is explicitly a product of the Cold War, so it could have been at the Institute at any period between the 1950s and the 1980s, or potentially even later. But the fact that the Doctor's original lore affirms he went to Yale does give us a hint. Yale wasn't desegregated widely until 1964, and Herman was stated to have been at the Institute for long enough that people started to forget his name. So, his final abduction by the entity was likely 10 years or more after this date, probably late 70s, if not maybe into the 80s. We don't have a concrete date, so that's the best thing we can go off for now. Maybe we'll see more in the future. At about the same time as all this was going down, Lisa Sherwood, the young girl who had become the Hag, was getting an education. It was a little hard to precisely date Lisa's timeline. Her design as this descendant of black migrants who formed a community in the Deep South definitely alludes to the Haitian exodus to Louisiana in the 18th century, where war sent thousands of Haitian migrants to the US, and 90% of them settled in or around New Orleans. The swampy bayou setting supports this reading too, which makes it a little easier to date Lisa's lore because it means that regardless of when her lore happened, it had to have been at least a bit after 1960. Even though the Brown v. Board of Education court case in 1954 found segregated schooling to be unconstitutional, schools in Louisiana didn't even start to become desegregated until 1960. There was a whole series of riots and public outcries about it, 4 6-year-old black girls getting death threats and harassment to the point that most of their white classmates left the schools they joined, and they required US Marshals to escort them to school until the riots died down and schools became fully desegregated in 1962. It's a super fascinating piece of history I had no idea about until making this video, so I've attached some reading material in a YouTube video if you want to learn more about the New Orleans Four, because it's a really fascinating story, but this video is already plenty long enough. But for our purposes, it dates Hag's lore as taking place at some point between the later half of the 1960s or more likely the 1970s. In the years to come, Lisa was straddling the line between living a modern life outside of her traditional community and remaining safe in the village and traditions her grandmother had helped maintain, before she was abducted by the entity, before she was abducted by a bunch of cannibals, twisted and devoured into using her power for evil, and becoming the Hag we all know and love. On October the 31st, 1978, death comes to Haddonfield. 15 years to the day after killing his sister Judith with a kitchen knife, the mental patient Michael Myers escapes a Smith Grove sanitarium and returns to his hometown, taking up residence in the old Myers house. He leaves a trail of bodies throughout Haddonfield on Halloween night, picking off family pets and horny teenagers one by one until he comes across Laurie Strode. Pursued by his Dr. Loomis and fended off by Laurie, Michael is shot and stabbed and winds up falling from a balcony, but his body vanishes from the Strode family lawn before it could be recovered. Both he and his final would-be victim are seized by the entity as Dead by Daylight's first full licensed chapter. In 1980, we return to Cedar Hills, where the zero-budget indie production of the horror film Murder Mill leads the cast and crew, Jaime, Chris, Robert, Bonnie and Linda, into the Cedar Steel plant, where they find the remains of Frank Stone's killing spree. The site of Frank's death in the mill furnace becomes an overlap between the world of the entity and the real world, and the group is confronted by the spectre of Frank Stone reborn into the steel mill. Thanks to the supermassive way of telling stories, whatever happens here is mostly up to you when you're playing through the casting of Frank Stone for yourself, which you should probably do, by the way. It's a really fun game. But no matter which choice you make in the story, Bonnie is always sacrificed, and Chris the director is always transported to 2024. A freak accident that definitely won't come back later, I promise. Only a year later, in the summer of 1981, Ash Williams goes to the Nobi cabin with his friends Scotty and Shelley, his sister Cheryl, and his girlfriend Linda. They discover a cursed recording by Professor Raymond Nobi and wind up reading from the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, the Book of the Dead, a cursed book bound in human skin that summons an ancient evil, the Kandarian demon. The demon toys with Ash and the others, slaughtering Ash's friends one by one and possessing them to force him to destroy their bodies completely. He is left the sole survivor as he staggers from the cabin, broken and alone, which won't relate to anything that happens later, I promise. 1985 sees the events of Stranger Things Season 3, in which both Steve and Nancy get taken by the entity. The aspiring journalist Nancy Wheeler gets a lead that ties her to the Hawkins National Laboratory and calls her friend Steve Harrington to help her investigate, but both get taken by the entity. I guess the Demogorgon probably comes from here as well. Its only add-ons seem to relate to Season 1 specifically, so maybe it's the demo that we see in the first season, but there's nothing in its extremely brief lore to indicate that it's the same Demogorgon that we saw in the first season, so I'm just gonna put it here because there's literally nowhere else to reasonably put the Demogorgon. Yeah, Stranger Things lore for DVD is really brief. I wish there was more to say, but it just kinda sucks. In 1987, the events of Hellraiser took place and the world was introduced to the Hell Priest himself, Pinhead. Really, Hellraiser is less the story of Pinhead himself and more of the Lament configuration, the arcane artifact that contains the forbidden pains and pleasures of the Cenobites. Pinhead and his acolytes form a group of Cenobites known as the Gash, who pursue anyone who solves the Lament configuration to show them the gift of exquisite agony and forbidden sensation. This is what they do to the hedonist Frank Cotton when he opens the box. But when Frank escapes his torture at their hands and his niece Kirsty starts fiddling with the Lament configuration, well, let's just say it all goes to hell pretty fast. There's no explicit date given as to when Pinhead joined the realm. The box basically turned up in the realm one day, and the Mori implies Pinhead can leave or enter whenever he likes, but all the add-ons are taken from the first movie set in 1987, so that's the date I'm going to go with, and given that we lost the license back in April, we're unlikely to ever get any information to the contrary. At some point between the late 1980s and early 1990s, a decade or so after the Nigerian Civil War, a now adult Philip Ajomo arrives in America and gets a job at Azarov's junkyard, the Autohaven Wreckers Yard. After such a brutal childhood growing up in Nigeria, Philip just wanted a quiet life where he could stay out of trouble. He could just work the crusher, take his paycheck and go home, nothing too crazy. Unfortunately, it wasn't too long before he found a living human in one of the cars he was set to crush. But before he could save him, Azarov turned on the crusher and pulverized the man completely. It turns out Philip was just another tool of organised crime, functionally an executioner with huge amounts of blood on his hands without even knowing it. This understandably pissed Philip off no end. He pushed Azarov into the crusher and tore his spine out as the uncaring machine ripped his boss's body apart. The entity claimed Philip shortly after, crafting Azarov's spine into the weapon he would wield as the Wraith. In 1990, the events of Child's Play 2 took place, 2 years after Andy Barclay was terrorized by Chucky. The good guy doll that was possessed by the murderer Charles Lee Ray got melted down at the end of the first movie, but was eventually rebuilt by the Play Pals toy company as a PR stunt, and Chucky's spirit returned to the doll to give Andy the fight of his 8 years of life. This culminated in a madcap chase around the Play Pals doll factory, where an avalanche of boxed good guy dolls collapsed onto Chucky and brought Andy an opportunity to escape. But Andy ran into the fog. Taken by the entity, and Chucky, invigorated by his desire to kill this 8-year-old boy like a completely normal person, scampered in after him. Child's Play 2 took place in California, but our next killer takes us from West Coast to East Coast, because we're in Florida, and the Ghostface Killer strikes in Roseville. Danny Johnson was brought up by his military father to value killing as a ritual, and idolize serial killers in real life and fiction alike. He grabbed a rudimentary version of the iconic Ghostface costume to terrorize some college kids, but once he got good, he got really good at killing. He made death his life's work, planning out elaborate murder schemes for weeks, and writing about the elusive Ghostface killings in the Roseville Gazette for his day job under the name Jed Olson. One of these days, Danny just up and disappeared. The old school point-and-shoot camera dates him to the 90s, the same era as his clear inspiration Scream, if not slightly before. And it's been my headcanon for a while that it was Danny's infamy as the Ghostface of Roseville that inspired Billy and Stu to put on the mask in Woodsboro. Because let's be honest, they are nowhere near smart enough to come up with this stuff on their own. But there is no canon information to support this reading because DVD's Ghostface cannot legally acknowledge the existence of Scream. So while I'm going to roll with it personally, there's nothing authentic enough to confirm this. Throughout the 1990s, a lot of other killers got started, and we start to see some of the modern, non-Vittorio and Trevor survivors start to make themselves known. In 1993, the events of the first Five Nights at Freddy's game take place, leading to the closure of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria and the eventual spring locking of William Afton in the pizzeria's safe room. But that won't relate to anything that happens later, I promise. A year later, we bore witness to the traumatic events of the original Silent Hill 2, where James Sunderland got put through the ringer and wound up encountering the avatar of his guilt, the Red Pyramid Thing, better known as Pyramid Head. How James's journey with his guilt concludes is very much up for interpretation. Everyone has their own theories about which Silent Hill 2 ending is canon, but one way or another it resulted in the acquisition of Pyramid Head by the entity. It's worth noting, nothing in Silent Hill 2 explicitly dates the game taking place in 1994, but a general knowledge of Silent Hill lore and an analysis of the calendar Maria finds in the Born Upon a Wish DLC does help us narrow it down. And by us, I mean this really cool guy Mega Bears fan who dedicated this article to dating all of the Team Silent games. Link to it is in the description. It's generally accepted that Silent Hill 2 takes place about 3 years after events of Silent Hill 1, and in Born Upon a Wish, Maria finds a calendar showing November. November in which the first day of the month happens to fall on a Thursday, and the last day on a Friday. This would reasonably put the year of that calendar as 1979, 1984, or 1990. When you examine that calendar, Maria comments that the calendar is from 10 years ago, which would put Silent Hill 2 in either 1989, 1994, or 2000. A sign in Silent Hill 1 indicates a store that's apparently been open since 1987, meaning Silent Hill 2 can't have been 1989, since that would put Silent Hill 1 in 1986, which wouldn't make sense with that sign. And if Silent Hill 2 was in 2000, it would put Silent Hill 3, which is set 17 years after 1 and therefore 14 years after 2, in 2014, which doesn't make sense with the level of technology that we see throughout that game, meaning that the only reasonable date that Maria could be alluding to with the calendar is 1994. But this tweet from Masahiro Ito says it's not in the 90s, which would make Silent Hill 2 a prequel to the first game, and that just throws everything we know about dating the series out of whack, so fuck it, what do any of us know anyway? In 1996, the same year that Scream took place, the young vagabond Frank Morrison arrived in Ormond, Alberta. He spent his youth bounced from care home to care home until one day he met Julie Kostenko, a senior at Ormond High, and her friends Joey Moore and Susie Lavoie. The four united to form the Legion, a gang of hooligans who terrorised the town, stealing, vandalising and generally doing mischief, but Frank kept testing the limits, trying to push the group into doing more and more dangerous activities, until he stole a candy bar from Joey's place of work, resulting in the young man's firing. Of course, Frank didn't tell the group he'd taken the candy bar and gotten Joey fired. Instead, he goaded Joey into leading the group to vandalise that store in revenge. But it all went sideways when a cleaner at the store apprehended Julie. Frank stabbed him first, then Julie, then Joey and Susie were finally goaded into it. The Legion had taken their first life, and were taken by the entity while disposing of the body up at Mount Ormond Resort. Legion is one of the best documented killers in the entire game in terms of lore, so if you're interested to learn more about them, then I seriously recommend the Legion comics by Nadia Shamas. They're a lot of fun and paint the picture of the Legion in far more detail than most DPD characters get to enjoy, so definitely do go pick them up. In 1997, a series of unexplained deaths linked to a strange videotape drew reporter Reiko Asakawa to investigate. She watches the tape, causing the vengeful Onryo Sadako Yamamura to haunt Reiko and her family. She eventually escapes the curse, but not before Sadako kills her ex-husband Ryuji and attaches herself to her son Yuichi. 6 months later, Ring 2 takes place and Yuichi starts to display similar psychic traits to Sadako, and despite Reiko being run over by a car, one of Ryuji's students successfully exorcises Sadako from Yuichi's body. At some point after this, Sadako was taken by the Entity but would wait 20 years before Yuichi would follow her in. 1998 is where Resident Evil starts to join the timeline. As you might imagine, with a series actively being remade as we speak, the timeline gets a little bit fuzzy in places. Rebecca and Wesker are both taken from the game's original timeline, but Ada, Jill, Leon and Nemesis are all taken from the remake depictions instead, where the timeline is slightly different. In the original timeline, the events of Resident Evil 0 take place on July the 23rd, 1998. At only 18 years old, Rebecca Chambers is the youngest member of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, STARS, as a field medic dispatched alongside the rest of Bravo team to an Umbrella Corporation research facility in the Arklay Mountains. When all hell breaks loose, she's separated from Bravo team inside an Umbrella facility full of monsters, and the Entity abducts her before she can find her way out. A couple of months later in the remake timeline, the T-Virus is unleashed on Raccoon City. Law and order are thrown to the wind as virus-infected zombies and Umbrella bioweapons terrorise the streets, leading to the events of the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes that take place on September 30th, 1998. On his first day on the job, fresh-faced RPD recruit Leon Kennedy investigates the biohazard that has taken over the city, only to be taken by the Entity once he broke into a top-secret Umbrella Corporation lab. Meanwhile, the STARS Alpha Team deputy, Jill Valentine, is pursued by the bioweapon Nemesis throughout the city. Umbrella assign a relentless pursuer to take Jill out in the chaos, so that the truth of their work never made it public. But both are taken by the Entity before the Nemesis is able to complete its assignment. We go from Capcom to Konami now, with the end of Dracula's canonical story in Castlevania, the Battle of 1999. We've never actually seen before the Battle of 1999 in any piece of Castlevania media, but it's how Dracula's DVD lore ends, where he's finally killed by Alucard and the latest in a long line of Belmonts, Leon Belmont. In the main Castlevania canon, he winds up reincarnating into Soma Cruz, but in Dead by Daylight's version of events, Dracula is abducted by the Entity instead, to continue his reign of terror for all eternity in the fog. While the Battle of 1999 is the last event with an exact year that takes place before the 21st century, there's a few other stories in this period that are set into motion in the late 90s or early 2000s, and to see the first one, we had to pay a little visit to Greenville. Greenville is a fairly normal small American town. Coffee shop, high school, theatre, nothing really out of the ordinary. Michaela Reed, a barista at the Moonstone coffee shop, starts having dreams of a world of horror, where monsters hunt innocent victims in the night, and she's absolutely enthralled. As a wannabe horror writer herself and witchcraft practitioner, she takes these visions with gusto. At least until her best friend Julian disappears into the night. Shortly afterwards, she vanishes too, on stage in front of a massive crowd at the Moonstone as she reads a tale of horror inspired by the nightmares she experienced. Her other best friend is the podcaster Sable Ward, who wasn't mentioned at any point in the story up until now, and she tries to figure out what's going on and track Michaela down. The disappearances are blamed on a mysterious urban legend, the story of a creature that targets those who investigate it and try to understand it. The unknown. So of course a reporter begins to investigate the disappearances and pins them on the unknown, an act that those of us with genre awareness would call poking the bear. True to the myths, the unknown manifests itself to Olivia and almost kills her, but it is taken by the Entity before it has the chance. The story of Michaela and Sable will be picked up a little bit later, but 3 other characters also begin their journey into becoming killers just at the turn of the Millennium. In the late 90s, the World Wide Web was becoming part of everyday life, and this caused the dot-com bubble, a brief window where if you had an online business with any amount of traffic, really any website at all about basically anything that you could monetize, some forward-thinking venture capitalists would hurl money at you because they thought that you could be the next Amazon or eBay. In Fortaleza in Brazil, this was an environment that an early teenage Adriana Ramai could capitalize on. Adriana's father Saita became more distant as he was plagued by horrifying visions, and his career as a mangaka was failing, so Adriana was looking for a way to make her own money. She'd been spending her time hosting a website about Brazilian manga and anime for a little bit, and she sold the website for a chunky payout before the markets crashed, entering a world of corporate investment before she even finished high school. Meanwhile, in Springwood, Ohio, the children at the Badham preschool were coming home troubled. They had unexplained injuries, clothing damage, and stories of trauma and pain at the hands of the school groundskeeper Freddy Krueger. After fleeing the school and hiding away, Krueger is burned to death by the parents of Springwood out of a fear that he molested their children. I'm sure that neither a soulless transaction of art of a profit, starting a young egomaniac off in a world of corporate investment, nor the immolation of a sadistic paedophile relate to anything that happens later, I promise. And thus we leave the slasher age behind, as the late 1990s and early 2000s sow the seeds of a new breed of stories. Analog horror, found footage, self-aware horror comedies like Scream, and the rise of the internet changed how people consume the world around them, including consuming horror stories. And the DVD chapters set in this era change how new horror is understood by its consumers. Most original survivors also come from this period in the 21st century because they're explicitly intended to be everymen, the kind of people you could meet on the street, and it's probably easier to make a relatable character when they're part of a time period you are alive in. The following survivors appear to have come from the 2000s before the entity took them: Meg Thomas, Nia Carlson, and Jake Park. Meg and Nia both tell stories of troubled teenagers in small-town America trying to live challenging lives in their own ways. Meg has implied ADHD and is living with her terminally ill mother, choosing to give up her scholarship for university to take care of her, while Nia is a fish out of water, struggling to belong and motivate herself after her family uprooted from Sweden. And Jake can't live with the expectations of his wealthy and status-obsessed family, preferring to depart from public life completely and go and live in the woods. In all three cases, I'm assuming they come from the 2000s based on the clothing technology that sort of gives me these vibes. I don't have anything concrete to go on in these cases. The car Nia vandalizes looks old and ostentatious. The idea of a hazing ritual for high school athletics competitions is also very 2000s coming-of-age movie-y. And the closest thing that we have to modern-day stuff that we ever see Jake using is an old-school walkie-talkie. If we're told that all three of these survivors were from the 2020s or even the 1990s, I would probably believe it. But I'm going to go for the early 2000s because it's the best guess I've got. For these guys, I encourage you to make your own decision because we've not got a lot to work on. But they're not the only teenage would-be survivors bumming around in the early 2000s. The Black Veil did not exist for centuries of strife and bloodshed without making enemies, and a group of those enemies called the Imperiati met up on Dyer Island, the former home of the Blight, to discuss their next move. Several of these members have children of their own who they brought to the island, two of those being Elodie Rokoto and Felix Richter. Those two, alongside 5 other teenage Imperiati kids, formed a little gang called the Pariahs, and Elodie led them across the island on expeditions. One day, Elodie found carvings and ritual markings etched into the wall of one of Talbot's old laboratories, and when she felt compelled to touch them, a wild and horrifying cataclysm struck the island. Elodie and Felix never saw their parents again, and thus began a years-long obsession for Elodie and a lifetime of grieving and self-doubt for Felix. But we'll get to those later. 2004 saw 2 notable licensed inclusions from 2 different universes. For the first, we have to return to the Resident Evil remake timeline for the events of the Resident Evil 4 remake. After escaping Raccoon City's destruction 6 years prior, Ada Wong is assigned by Albert Wesker to infiltrate Los Illuminados, the cult led by Osmond Sadler. Her mission? To retrieve a Las Plagas amber sample by any means, and if need be, to distract Leon Kennedy from his mission to retrieve Ashley Graham. Unfortunately, the entity took her before she got the chance. Interestingly, Project W was released in August 2022, whereas RE4's remake wasn't released until March 2023, which makes Ada the only character in DBD to get taken by the entity at a point in her timeline that her source material hasn't actually reached yet. Not gonna lie, I think that's pretty cool. But only a few months after the Los Illuminados incident, the events of Saw take place in an undisclosed Seattle core city that John Kramer calls home. Detective David Tapp is assigned to a series of killings by the mysterious Jigsaw, and works alongside his partner Stephen Singh and the Jigsaw consultant Alison Kerry as he draws up a list of suspects. First and foremost among them is Dr. Lawrence Gordon. After Singh is killed in a confrontation with the masked Jigsaw, Tapp becomes completely obsessed with Gordon. Even after being kicked off the force, he continues to pursue the case on his own, and watches the Gordon family like a hawk, paying the photographer Adam Stanheidt to watch Lawrence and staking out the family home. It's only when Zepp Hindle, who's being manipulated by the real Jigsaw, attacks Dr. Gordon's wife and daughter that Tapp realises Gordon is not the killer he's looking for, and he jumps into action to capture Zepp. He saves the Gordon family, but in pursuit of Jigsaw, he's ultimately killed by Zep, and the entity scoops him up from the world on his deathbed, ready for his new life as a survivor. 2 years later, in April 2006, the events of Saw 3 are set into motion with the abduction of the Denlon family. The Jigsaw killer, John Kramer, is dying, and his apprentice Amanda Young has captured the skilled neurosurgeon Lynn Denlon to ease the pressure on his brain and potentially save his life. Meanwhile, her husband Jeff is living through a game of his own, where he's forced to forgive or condemn the many people he has blamed for ruining his life in the car accident that killed his son. But the whole game is secretly a test of loyalty for Amanda. Her faith in Jigsaw and his methods are flagging, and her paranoia and misanthropy leads her to build inescapable traps for her victims and become increasingly jealous of the affection John shows for Lynn. Jeff and Amanda both ultimately fail to learn their lessons, and Jeff shoots her, and then kills John at the game's conclusion before the shotgun collar built by Amanda covers the walls of the meat plant in Lynn Denlon's brains. Bleeding to death with a bullet wound to the neck on the floor of the Gideon meatpacking plant, Amanda Young is taken by the entity and begins her new existence as the Pig. At some point in the early to mid-2000s, a young woman named Rin Yamaoka was dying, bleeding from dozens of wounds as shards of broken glass dug into her body. The Yamaoka family was an old noble family who had fallen on hard times, and everyone was feeling the strain. Rin's mother was deathly ill, her father was wearing himself down to the bone to support them, and Rin herself was studying hard and working a part-time job to lend a hand where she could. Her father insisted on keeping up appearances, staying in the old family home and keeping Rin's kendo lessons going even as the situation got worse and eventually he was fired. To put it simply, he did not take that well. Rin found her father trapped in a bloodthirsty rage, hacking his wife apart with a family katana before turning on Rin. She tried to fight back but was pushed through a window, and while she lay there covered in blood and shards of glass, the entity reached out for her. You see, it had been grooming Rin's father into a killer by harnessing the same rage of their ancestor Kazan. But when Rin's bitterness and hatred of her father bubbled up in that moment, the entity realised it had a better candidate right here, and Rin Yamaoka's fate as the spirit was sealed. We don't really have a concrete date for Rin's abduction, but we do have a few clues. She's noted as being a student at Takamatsu University, which was founded in 1996, meaning her law couldn't have taken place before that time. Her design is also heavily inspired by The Grudge, to the point that she even has a score event directly named after it, and the film was released and set in 2006, so I'm comfortable putting her at a similar place and time. 17 years after the events of the first Silent Hill game, Heather Mason takes the helm in Silent Hill 3, dealing with the death of her father Harry and confronting the evil that's cast a shadow over her entire life. Claudia Wolf, the High Priestess of the Order based in Silent Hill, wants to reincarnate their god inside Heather's body, but she thoroughly rejects being the mother of some new monstrous deity, choosing instead to beat the shit out of it with a metal pipe. DBD catches up with her when she's all grown up, working at a suicide hotline and finally overcoming the death of her father. But no matter what she did, no matter how long had passed, the memory of what happened to her and her father never quite let her have peace. This manifests first as constant recurring nightmares, and then a phone call from none other than Claudia Wolf herself, long dead but still speaking to Cheryl on the phone of the suicide hotline. The survivor's guilt pooled and eddied around her until the entity paid her a visit and dragged her into a new nightmare. In terms of the timescale for Silent Hill 3, we went over earlier how Silent Hill 1 seems to have been set in 1991, judging by the calendar in Born Upon a Wish, and Silent Hill 2 is set 3 years after the first game. Heather in this game is 17 years old, meaning Silent Hill 3 must take place in 2008 if 1991 is the correct date for the first game's events. And the technology of the era, like payphones, fax machine and bulky TVs that we see even outside of Silent Hill, seem to support this to some level. A lot of this stuff is a little old for 2008, but not so old-fashioned that it feels egregiously out of place. In another universe altogether, it's 2009, and the world has ended. Left 4 Dead sees the green flu overtake the world and only a few survivors remain, fighting through the hordes of the undead to try and find somewhere safe to hide, fortify, and live out the rest of their lives in peace. Bill, Francis, Lewis and Zoe aren't what you'd call the best of friends, But they look out for one another as they flee across the United States, and this culminates in the events of Left 4 Dead: The Sacrifice. Going out like the champ he is, Bill Overbeck is mobbed by zombies as he repairs a generator to raise a bridge, allowing Zoe, and Francis and Lewis I guess, to escape on a boat to a safe island haven where they can finally be safe and not risk spreading the virus to anybody else. But at the last moment, the entity intervenes on Bill's deathbed to ensure he'll be repairing a few more generators to come. But this wasn't the only biohazard making a mess in 2009, because the events of Resident Evil 5 were also taking place. Albert Wesker took over Tricell operations in the Kajuju Autonomous Zone and exposes himself to Ouroboros, the powerful virus he engineered using the T. Veronica virus, G virus, and Las Plagas to evolve humanity in his image. But before he can put his plan to work, the entity seizes him for the trials. This is from the original timeline, of course, since there's no RE5 remake yet, and that's the end of the Resident Evil representation in Dead by Daylight. For now, anyway. As we enter the 2010s, a bulk of original survivors start to join the story, because, as I said before, DBD loves their contemporary survivors. For 2010 survivors who aren't directly connected to their killers, we've got Jeff Johansson, Dwight Fairfield, Claudette Morale, Fang Min, Ace Visconti, Jane Romero, Yui Kimura, Adam Francis, David King, Kate Denson, Zarina Cassia, Hadi Kaur, Tori Kane, and Jonah Vasquez. There are some characters and content that are placing in the 2010s, and the perfect example here is Jeff, who was a young video store clerk in 1996 in Ormond and was an acquaintance of the Legion. If he was a young teenager in the 1990s, as the Legion comics seem to suggest, then him being in his 30s now would make sense. He grew up to be a sensitive and insightful artist brought up by rock and metal, but wound up being taken into the fog because he returned to Ormond, where the entity was already waiting for him. But maybe if he'd fallen in too much with the wrong crowd, he could just as easily have wound up as a 5th Legion member instead. There are other characters who I'm happy placing in the 2010s due to the technology that we see them interacting with, like, for example, Ace. Ace is a gambler who bounces from place to place, never really settling down and winning money as fast as he loses it. This is the kind of character that could exist at any time, anywhere in the world. But we can see in his Tome cinematic that smartphones are around and very common because he uses one as a timer. So 2010s is my guess. Same goes for Feng Min, a pro gamer from China who has to deal with the demands her lifestyle has on her, and eventually with the deaths of her teammates in a road collision that was in large part her own fault. Her Tome cinematic in Tome 17 shows that her personal computer, which she breaks in a fit of rage, has a thin flat screen monitor, which dates it to a similar time in about the 2010s. Even Jonah is dated similarly as well. He's a CIA codebreaker who's fucking around in foreign countries and responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, which unfortunately doesn't narrow it down in terms of time since the CIA has been doing this shit for decades now and has no capacity to stop. But he does put a modern PDA-type tablet thing out in the trials, which is from the 2010s or at least the 2000s. A few more of these characters have stories that directly link together in some capacity that helps us constitute a proper timeline. Zarina Cassia, for example, explicitly from the 2010s, since her entries in Tome 18 suggest that she was a little girl when 9/11 happened, and that being a young Arab girl in a post-9/11 New York changed how she grew up. So a late 20s or early 30s age guesstimation for her would put her squarely in the 2010s. But shortly after the entity took her, Zarina's mother winds up talking to Jane Romero in Tome 22's story. Jane is a daytime TV host and well-known celebrity, and she's seen using a smartphone in her first Tome cinematic as well, so her being in the 2010s works alongside everything we know already. But for the rest of these survivors, we just kinda don't know when they were about, so I'm gonna guess 2010s because that's the earliest I think they could reasonably have been kicking around. Dwight, Claudette, Adam, Yui, Kate, Hadi and Tori aren't really given much for us to go on in terms of dating the characters, because all the images that we're presented about them could be from any time, from the 2000s to the 2020s. That's mostly an issue that Behaviour have long had with their early survivors. They just weren't fleshed out too much in their base lore, so unless the tome specifically gives us a time period to go on, we just sort of have to guess that they're contemporary to when they were made, which for most characters in this list was in the 2010s. But Hadi and Tori have a little bit of a twist in this. Hadi and Tori's stories are intertwined with Tori's abduction of Hadi's brother Jordan. Hadi is a podcaster who was affected by the trauma of losing her parents in a car accident, but that trauma unlocked her potential as an entity-sensitive individual. She travels around the world with her adoptive brother Jordan, investigating supernatural occurrences around the world and documenting them for their podcast, Ravages of the Abyss. Hattie's lore ends up with her being taken by the entity, but not before getting on the radar of the Black Veil, and that's where Tori comes in. Tori Kane is a young Black Veil cultist from Scotland who routinely wandered through the overlaps and basically vibed on the entity's front door in order to appease the Black Veil cult. Her final task to prove her devotion and become a full-fledged member of the Inner Circle is to capture and sacrifice Jordan, but a moment of hesitation saves his life and condemns Tori to the fog as a survivor. Crucially, there's nothing in either Hattie or Tori's stories that explicitly dates them. Hattie's ghost hunting hardware isn't exactly ancient, but it has enough analogue bits to look like it could be 20 years old or more. We simply don't know how old Hattie and Tori's stories are, but we do know that they're sequential. Tori's happen straight after Hattie's, so if we ever get a date for either of these stories, we'll know how old the other one was as well. There are a couple of survivors who are more explicitly dated to the 2020s, and any of these unknown survivors might be too, especially Hattie and Tori, since they were made in the 2020s themselves. But there's quite a few other characters who we can be reasonably sure do come from the 2010s. In 2010, the esteemed writer Alan Wake visits Bright Falls in Maine, alongside his wife Alice Wake. He's been in a bit of a writing funk lately, and his wife seems to think that a lakeside cabin, a trip to Deerfest, and an appointment with a therapist might get him out of his terminal writer's block. But the mysterious dark presence that lives under Cauldron Lake attempts to use Alan's writing skills to escape the lake and realise itself in the material world, leading to the events of Alan Wake, where it abducts Alice and Alan winds up sealing himself alongside it so it can never escape Cauldron Lake. Alan will remain here for 13 years stuck in the dark place, trying to write his way out in a way that wouldn't allow the dark presence to follow him into the real world. At some point between 2010 and 2023, Alan attempts to explore outside the dark place via one of his Night Spring stories that he wrote as a novice writer. It told of a realm of fog and nightmares where serial killers stalked the woods at the behest of a terrible and all-powerful entity. While still tucked away in the writer's room, Alan wrote a copy of himself as the main character in that story, a self-insert protagonist if you like, and that fictionalised version of Alan winds up in the entity's realm, unable to ever leave the torment of the trials. But the dark place isn't the only surreal dream world the entity will breach in 2010, because that's also the year of the Nightmare on Elm Street remake. Remember that pedo who got all crispy back in the late 90s? Well, when those kids are in high school, Freddy Krueger returns in the dreams of his former victims, killing and tormenting them one by one. The dream detective Quentin Smith and Freddy's favourite Nancy Thompson go through a thoroughly boring movie before pulling him into the real world and beating the shit out of him, finally believing they'd defeated him. But DBD's lore picks up where the Nightmare remake left off with that dreadful cliffhanger. DBD's lore picks up Freddy's return to Springwood after this movie's events. He wants another go at Nancy, but Quentin takes matters into his own hands and fights back, dragging himself and Freddy into the entity's realm in a last-ditch attempt to protect Nancy from him. Never forget, no matter how lame the Nightmare remake is, Quentin Smith has the biggest balls in the fog and you will never change my mind on that one. Somewhere around 2011 or 2012, the events of Tokyo Ghoul Season 1 transpired, and Ken Kaneki is trying to live a normal life. He's just an ordinary kid who sees a cute girl at a coffee shop and wants to go on a dinner date with her. But unfortunately the object of his affection is none other than Rize Kamishiro, a cannibalistic ghoul serial killer known as the Binge Eater. She attempts to take a bite out of the young man, but falling metal beams see both of them grievously injured, and Kaneki winds up receiving an organ transplant from Rize and turning into a half-ghoul. Horrified by his new hunger for human flesh, he takes refuge at the Anteku coffee shop before being abducted by the serial killer Yamori, who tortured him in an abandoned theatre for 2 full weeks. Ken Kaneki had lost everything. As far as he could tell, his death was a certainty. He had no chance of rescue, and the kindness and pacifism he had held as core to his identity had only gotten him hurt. After some not-so-subtle goading from a hallucination of Rize, he rejects the trappings of morality he had been taught, breaks free effortlessly and devours Yamori's Kagune, but is taken by the entity before he could escape the theatre he was imprisoned in. Speaking of taking a level in badass, 2013 shows Lara Croft going from earnest archaeologist to seasoned survivalist in the events of Tomb Raider. The academic-cum-adventurer is shipwrecked on the mythical island of Yamatai, where her friend Sam is taken by the cult leader Matthias and his brotherhood the Solari. The island is held in the grip of a supernaturally powerful storm that prevents anybody from leaving, and Matthias believes that offering Sam as a vessel for the goddess Himiko will placate her spirit and finally allow the cult to leave the island. Lara cobbles together equipment and weaponry from shipwrecks and scraps and attacks a Solari stronghold to save Sam, but is captured and almost imprisoned by Matthias' flunkies. She dives into a river of blood and gore to escape them, but as she struggles to resurface, the entity ensures she'll never come back up for air. The teenage Felix and Elodie that we saw as pariahs on Dire Island were also taken from the 2010s, as their adult lives are driven in separate ways. Felix tried to move on from what happened to his parents as he became a successful architect and eventually an expectant father, but his mental health slowly crumbled as his anxieties and insecurities built up. Meanwhile, Elodie had allowed the disappearances on Dire Island to completely consume her life, which she would spend collecting arcane artifacts and uncovering mysteries in an attempt to find out what happened to her parents, and maybe someday bring them home. Felix was taken during the Dire Island restoration project after the Imperiati paid him to return to the island, while Elodie encountered the Black Veil in Paris and inadvertently banished herself to the realm of the entity. I'm confident in my ability to date Felix, nope, not like that, by the medals that he won. He won the Swiss Architect Medal, which was founded in 2007, and the German National Design Award, which started in the 1990s but was discontinued in 2014. This means there was a 7-year window in the late 2000s and early 2010s where he could have been at the prime of his field as a young professional, which gives him time to start to become a father in the later half of the 2010s, and this conveniently dates Elodie to the same time period as well, putting her present day in the 2010s and letting us confidently place their teenage years as the pariahs in the 1990s. Between the late 2010s and early 2020s, the killing spree of Ji-woon Hak, better known as the Trickster, reached its crescendo. Ji-woon, known on stage as the Trickster, spent his entire life working towards the greatest performance of his career. As a boy, he would perform complex knife tricks to entertain guests at his father's restaurant, and he broke into the grueling world of an idol as a member of No Spin before the fire that killed his bandmates kickstarted both his solo career and his fascination with death. He would kidnap fans, rivals, anybody really, and torture them to death on camera so that he could sample their screens for his music. But tonight would be his final performance, restrained in the theatre to watch him work, with a Mighty One executives who threatened to stifle his creative genius, and a woman who was just done with his shit, Yunjin Lee. Yunjin was Ji-woon's beleaguered manager and producer, and she was put in charge of getting No Spin on the straight and narrow. After the fire, he takes over managing Trickster's solo career, and his slide into psychopathy and violence does not go unnoticed. She hears audio in Trickster's music that lines up a little too closely with the voices of his victims on the news. He feeds her excuses about where he's been that just don't add up. But she doubts herself, and ultimately doesn't express her fears to the police because she doesn't see a realistic outcome where she's right, or where it ends up with her not just losing her job and prestige and potentially risking her safety, while Ji-woon walks free. And this all wraps up in an abandoned auditorium, where Ji-woon captures Yunjin and the Mighty One executives for his final bloody performance, but he's taken by the entity alongside Yunjin before he can finish her off. In 2018, almost 40 years after the events of the original Evil Dead, Ash Williams is still kicking evil's butt in his hometown of Elk Grove, Michigan, in Season 3 of Ash vs. Evil Dead. After he accidentally unleashed evil for the pages of the Necronomicon while high one time, he got together with his friends Pablo and Kelly, and eventually his teenage daughter Brandy that he never knew he had, to push back against the forces of darkness. After the Dark Ones were unleashed upon Elk Grove, he sent the others away to safety and defeated Kandar the Destroyer, but in doing so was cast into an apocalyptic future. In this future, the Dark Ones were still around and fucking humanity shit up 9 ways to Sunday, but Ash was more interested in returning to the present day, so he could potentially fight the Dark Ones in the present so this future would never come to pass. And reunite with his friends, of course. This is where Dead by Daylight catches up with him. While wandering the ruined future, he finds a Deadeye impersonating Linda Emery, his love interest from Season 2 of the show. He winds up overpowering the Deadite Linda and attempts to travel back to 2018 to reunite with his daughter and friends, but the entity has other plans for him. And this takes us to the 2020s, when we've got a couple of solo survivors who are explicitly from this time period, such as the wonderful new survivor, Aurella Rose. She's a transgender paramedic who studied hospitality at university, but after she realised she was at her most fulfilled saving lives, she wound up saving the life of a billionaire and finally getting her dream restaurant online. That's the kind of story that could have taken place at pretty much any time in the last 20 years, But it's worth noting that Sable's podcast, All Things Wicked This Night, is described as an old podcast, and that's when Aurella was at university, a long time before she was taken. For a podcast made in the 90s to be old 10-ish years ago, that means she was almost certainly taken in the early to mid 2020s. But at the same time as this was happening, a kite shop called Fun Kites Rio was opening in Brazil, staffed by Thalita and Renato Lira finally reuniting after their paths diverged growing up. Thalita and Renato used to be brought together for the sometimes painful but deeply rewarding sport of kite fighting, which is a huge deal in many parts of Brazil and beyond, but the two took separate paths as teenagers. Thalita was ever the overachiever, moving on to a brief career in modelling before she realised it wasn't quite getting her the personal fulfilment she wanted. Meanwhile, Renato was struggling to find himself, until he volunteered at an old folks' home playing guitar and caring for the people who needed it, and realised that he was at his best helping people. Together, the two opened the kite shop, hosted their first tournament together, and felt ready to move on to this fantastic new part of their lives. But it all went wrong when they followed a fallen kite and met someone they really shouldn't have done, someone who does not leave witnesses. Remember Adriana Ramay, that teenager in Fortaleza who sold off her website during the dot-com bubble? Well, she's a billionaire now, making her enormous fortune from slash-and-burn corporate acquisitions, crushing union activities, and other exceedingly unethical business practices. But now she's moonlighting as a serial killer too. Arming herself with the hardware produced by her tech company, she makes her own costume and takes on the identity of the Skull Merchant, one of her father's characters in the unpublished manga that serves as the only thing he left behind for his daughter. She kills for fun and profit, targeting anyone whose existence might prove a threat to her corporate interests and having a great time feeding her bottomless ego in the process. During one of these hunts, she encounters Thalita and Renato Lira on the beach and attempts to kill them out of fear they'll expose her double life and series of brutal murders, before all three are taken by the entity. That's how we know Thalita and Renato in the 2020s, by the way. For Adriana to be a young teenager in the turn of the millennium would put her at about her current age, her early to mid-30s, in 2020. And if she met Renato and Thalita at that time, they'd have to be in that time as well. The story of Ringu also continued in 2020, with Yoichi Asakawa, now 30 years old and a proficient marine biologist. Despite Sadako no longer being part of him, he starts to undergo visions and becomes obsessed with supernatural and ESP. His hard-won life as an esteemed academic is thrown into chaos as he tries to figure out what's wrong with him. He's sure Sadako has returned. He can't know for sure, but he feels it. But he's abducted by the entity before he comes to the end of his research. We're not exactly sure when in the 2020s Thalita, Renato and Skull Merchant stories happen, but for the rest of this timeline we actually have very reliable dates. For example, in 2023, Sympathy of the Devil released, which is a pretty solid movie starring Nicolas Cage and Joel Kinnaman, and if you watch that movie, you'll notice that DBD's version of Nick Cage wears an outfit very, very close to the one he wears in Sympathy for the Devil. This gives us a pretty decent ballpark for when he was taken by the entity, and that's really helpful because DBD's Nick Cage shows us a new element to the Black Veil that it really helps to put on a timeline. DBD's Nick Cage was hired by a Black Veil front company for the leading role in Descend Beyond, a film they were making that seems to be a recreation of the life of the Blight. Nick Cage took to the role of Talbot Grimes with gusto, reading the lines and making the inscriptions just like Talbot did 200 years ago. Except this time he's acting, obviously. The entity took him anyway. Judging by the actions of the director Pauline Stamper, there is every chance this was exactly what she intended. It's unclear whether Pauline Stamper is a descendant of Otto Stamper or just an alternative universe version of him who exists in our modern day. But we've never heard anything from Pauline Stamper since then, and I'd very much like to. But something else happened in 2023. The entity snapped up a new offering just before the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 3. 30 years after the events of FNAF 1, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria had long been closed down, but little did anybody know that rotting within its walls was the serial killer William Afton, sealed away in the body of a Springlock animatronic suit. When the Fazbear's Fright horror attraction opened in 2023, Springtrap was found in the pizzeria and was ready to be taken to Fazbear's Fright, since everyone thought he was just a normal animatronic. In the regular FNAF timeline, that's where he ends up, and the pizzeria burning down causes his presumed demise, and then the rest of the games that followed. But in DBD's timeline, he never leaves that pizzeria. The entity intercedes before this happens, and Springtrap is added to the roster of killers. The entity's next killer acquisition would only come a year later, as the casting of Frank Stone draws to its conclusion. After centuries of work for the Black Veil, Dr. Augustine Lieber's plan finally reaches fruition. She completely fuses all the murder mill film strips she's collected from different universes that are all pickled in the eldritch energies of the entity to create the champion, the final iteration of Frank Stone. Augustine offers Frank Stone as a gift to the entity, which they repay by stabbing Augustine in the neck, and Frank Stone, Augustine and Madison's entire world are taken by the entity. It's implied by the ending of casting of Frank Stone that Frank will go on to be a killer in the trials under his new identity as the champion. But it turns out he's going to be a trapper skin instead, coming in September. And can I just go off here a bit, because that's a massive injustice to one of DBD's most interesting new lore characters. Yes, the game did not do well, but Frank Stone as a character is not the reason why. If anything, the champion is probably the most anticipated part of the game, that everyone remembers the best, and turning him into a $15 cosmetic for one of the game's worst killers feels like a massive disservice. The fog calls for its champion. Let him in when the time comes, goddammit. The casting of Frank Stone marked the closest point in DBD's timeline to the present day, but we have a few more events set in the future, with explicit dates that we are given in the End Transmission and Alien chapters. In 2098, a nuclear war almost wipes out the human race, but humanity begins to rebuild from the ashes off the back of new technologies like cloning and the proliferation of robot workers. It's in this environment that Huxley Industries is founded, the company that will adopt large-scale clone workforces and use it to push humanity to the stars. I must say, it's pretty bold for DBD to assume we're lasting 73 whole years before the nuclear apocalypse, but let's be honest, that's the most believable part of Singularity's lore. Huxley wind up being responsible for a load of messed up stuff down the line, but in the Alien universe, the remorseless corporate overlords of Weyland-Yutani will make these guys look like the Red Cross. The events of Alien take place in 2122, where the crew of the mining vessel the Nostromo are manipulated by the company into playing host to a xenomorph, an alien monstrosity grown inside the ship's executive officer Kane and proceeds to slaughter the entire crew. Only the warrant officer Ellen Ripley survives, making it off the self-destructing ship with the Cat Jonesy and expelling the xenomorph into the vacuum of space. In the main Alien continuity, she winds up back on Earth almost a century later, while the xenomorph, Kane's son, winds up on the Romulus space station and massacres the scientists trying to study it, leading to the events of Alien Romulus. But in DBD's continuity, the Nostromo and its escape ship crash on Dvarka, and Ripley and Kane's son are both taken by the entity. The last sequential event in the Dead by Daylight timeline takes place in 2313, when Huxley Industries activates the Hux A713 robot in Jakarta. The newly built service robot is shipped alongside several other robots to the alien world of Dvarka, alongside a small crew of cloned humans, one of which is the engineer Gabriel Soma. But it all goes wrong when the lone Hux unit touches a mysterious alien crystal and gains sentience, realizing a true identity and sense of self for the first time and seeking to kill the Toba landing colonists so that there can be no threat to its new self-assured purpose. The systematic murder of every human and robot on the base takes up the events of End Transmission's lore, as Gabriel fights for his life and Hux assimilates the DNA of the crew to form a new, partially biological body. It culminates in a fireball of destruction as the base burns and Hux is about to finish Gabriel off, but both of them are taken by the entity before he gets the chance. And with Gabriel and Hux's abduction, so far, that's it. 2313 is the furthest in the future DBD has gone so far, and we're there. We've gone up and down the long bloody history of Dead by Daylight, from 2000 BC to the space age future, and seen the length and breadth of worlds of horror well beyond our own. From a fantasy world of magic and monsters, to multiple different zombie apocalypses, to a kite shop in Rio de Janeiro and whatever the hell Jonah was doing with those coordinates. This game has been going and growing for 9 years, and has created one of the most complex and interesting worlds in the modern gaming landscape. Whether or not this complexity always works in its favour is very much up in the air, but there is no denying just how much there is, how much depth it can have, and how exciting its future is likely to be. Right now, between FNAF and the high chance of The Walking Dead coming in this mid-chapter, we're in the middle of a major glut of licensed content. But originals are coming soon, and as characters like Yoichi, Nick Cage and Alan Wake have proven, licenses can still provide interesting new pieces to the Dead by Daylight puzzle. Whatever the future holds, I'm looking forward to it, and looking forward to hopefully seeing you there.